Yeah, so hi everyone. It's good to be here today, and sorry I wasn't able to make it earlier. And I'd also first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we're all meeting and working on, and their elders past, present and emerging. So yes, today I'll briefly describe the pilot monitoring, evaluation and research network that we're establishing in relation to post-fire recovery and weed management. And the project team includes quite a number of people from CSIRO and from TURN and from DOR, as you can see here. So I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of all these people. And I'd also like to thank the many NRMs who've participated to date in the various phases of the project, some of whom may be here today, like Paul. And I'm sorry if there's a bit of repetition for people who've heard some of this before. So before I talk about the post-fire monitoring pilot, I will just give you a bit of a broader background. So part of the goals of this project are to trial a network approach to learning from what we do in NRM. And so we're trialling this approach as a pilot network focusing on post-fire response of Australian vegetation. So the concept of the network is to build a coordinated and nationally distributed and embedded research infrastructure or plot network that is designed specifically to answer key questions. So that's all a bit of a mouthful, and I'll just break it down a little bit. So when I say it's question focused, you might have a suite of networks that are addressing different questions. And in this case, I'll talk about the questions we're addressing in the post-fire network in a minute. Another of the goals is to facilitate shared knowledge development, to better link science and decision-making and on-ground practice, so that we're co-developing and we're learning together rather than science being done and becoming irrelevant or being done in a less relevant way. A key element is linking across sites into a network, and that's very powerful because we ask our key questions in a wide range of contexts to learn not just what's happening at a site, but to learn about when and where things work. And by embedded, I mean we're measuring things in the context of what people are doing on the ground, rather than having a totally independent experiment that might not be really realistic. And finally, we are aiming for the plots and data to be widely accessible. And while we might have a few goals that we're designing the network around, usually there's quite a lot of other questions that could be addressed with the data. So over to the themes of this particular pilot network. As I said, different networks can focus on different questions. And in this case, the focus is on fire, and in particular on two key themes. So the first is simply to track how ecosystems are responding to fires in various parts of Australia. And through the network, we're able to address this question both at a site scale and at a broader national scale. So at a site scale, we can ask, well, how is your site responding to recent fire? Is it returning to pre-fire conditions, or is a new trajectory apparent? And then we can take the data from all the sites together to see how the site scale stories add up at a national scale. For example, how quickly are different types of systems recovering? Are there circumstances where the trajectory is not as expected, and so on? And so that diversity of sites across the network allows us to start asking questions like, what are the predictors of recovery effectiveness, and how does that inform investments in the future? And the second key theme of the pilot is around post-fire weed management. And in particular, at a site scale, we want to ask, how well are your weed control efforts working at your site? by comparing areas with and without weed control. You know, is the weed declining, but also is the native vegetation benefiting from the weed declining? And then how do those results vary across sites? Is weed management generally effective, or what are the predictors? If it's not always effective, what are the predictors of effectiveness? So those are the types of questions we're aiming to answer. And from this gives you a bit of an idea of the different stages of the project. From November, we held a number of workshops that you may have been involved in. And now we're at the stage of implementing the plots with partners and starting to roll out monitoring and training. And so I'll just give you an update on the monitoring design at each site, and then where we're at with the implementation. So I'm sorry to those who might have heard some of this detail on the design before, but just very quickly. What we're aiming at each site is to have one set of 4 plots, so replicated plots in a burnt area that hasn't had any treatment. And most of the plots are about 25 by 25 metres. And then we want to be able to compare those burnt plots with at least one of these 2 types of plots on the right. So either unburnt, untreated plots that are matched to what you would have expected the burnt plots to be before the fire. And that allows us to assess where we think if the burnt site was going to return to where it was, that's our guide to what that would be. And the other treatment we're keen to get is where weed control has been implemented in the burnt site. And so it might look like something like this in the landscape. You might have triplets or pairs of each of those 3 treatments scattered through the landscape. And after the various conversations we had through our workshops, we have aimed to focus on measurements on vegetation structure and vegetation composition, and also some initial soil sampling that can provide baseline soil data for anyone to draw on at a later time. But the plots and infrastructure, you know, the posts in the ground and the data associated with it are also available for anyone else to do other things with. They can analyse the data in different ways, or measure other things in the same plots, and use the benefit of having the vegetation data as a background to perhaps collecting invertebrate data or whatever. And so towards that monitoring, we've put together some standard monitoring protocols based on that are modification from some of the TURN standard monitoring protocols that have been rolled out in the last 10 years. And we've now just begun beta testing these methods. So now I'll move on to an update of where we're currently at with establishing the network. And so we began around this time last year, holding workshops, and we had input from over 150 service providers and scientists and policy makers into the design. There are over 300 people on the mailing list. And we had 26 service providers provided prior data sets that helped us design the network. And to date, we have 17 service providers involved in 22 sites that we've started marking out around the country, including 11 different NRM groups and their partner providers. And the sites are on a mix of land tenures around the country, particularly nature conservation areas, Indigenous protected areas, state forest and private land. So this gives you an idea of where we're at with starting to roll out the sites. The orange are sites where there's burnt and unburnt comparisons, and the blue is where we've got a potential weed comparison, weed control and no weed control. Most of these sites now have pegs in the ground, except for these ones here, where we've haven't been able to access yet due to COVID, but we're hoping to do that in the next few months. You can see there's a variety of vegetation types, including 4 rainforests, 4 temperate eucalypt woodlands, 3 tropical savannas, a couple of mallee woodlands, and some casuarina woodlands, and so on. And over half of them are in ecosystems that are listed as threatened at either the state or federal level. And as I mentioned, mostly we've just marked out the plots, but monitoring has also started to be rolled out, in, allowing us to test the monitoring protocols. And finally, I just wanted to conclude by outlining, the potential benefits of contributing to the network. So it's an opportunity for you to learn about the effectiveness of your own weed management, but also contribute to the national scale learnings. It includes capacity building and training and so on, to be able to undertake this kind of monitoring. And we hope it also will provide a network for connecting with others who are working in a similar space but different location around Australia. And of course, in the future, it will feed into potential design of other networks that might be rolled out to answer different questions. And I'll leave it there.